Welcome everyone to the African Politics Conference Group online colloquium. Today we are going to focus on the choices of being governed, a draft paper by University of Toronto PhD student Karol Czuba, whose name I just slaughtered, and I apologize to him and his family. We're also extremely lucky to have two distinguished discussants. One, we have Elizabeth Carlson, who is an assistant professor of political science at Penn State University. She has many wonderful publications in venues such as World Politics, Political Behavior, Comparative Political Studies, QJPS, on topics like ethnic voting, partisan bias, and distributed politics. Our other wonderful discussant is Professor Guy Grossman, Associate Professor of Political Science at University of Pennsylvania. We're sort of hitting the state of Pennsylvania this today in terms of their quota of discussants. Guy has a long CV, including publications in PNAS, APSR, JOP, AJPS, as well as a forthcoming book on the Medicata 1 project. He's into applied political economy, focusing on information, political accountability, and political participation. I am your host, Andy Harris. I'm located at NYU Abu Dhabi, where I'm an assistant professor of political science. Rules of the game, we're going to start off with about 5 minutes by Karol, just sort of introducing us all to the topic. Then we will move on, starting with Liz. She'll have about 10 minutes to discuss the paper, followed by about 10 minutes of Guy's comments. After that, we will open it up. I'll pass the baton back to Karol after that. You can respond a bit, and then we'll just take the discussion as it goes from there. I will note, if you click on the people link on the right side of your screen, I've already noticed we have one or two people come in and out. Hopefully we'll have a few more people join us. Keep in mind there are places there where you can mute your mic while you're not talking, in case you want to improve the dialogue everywhere else. That said, please remember to unmute your mic when you want to say something. So with that, I turn it over to Karol. Karol, you've got 5 minutes, and I am timing you.
Great. Thank you to you very much, Andy, and to other organizers for organizing the colloquium, and thank you for pronouncing my last name correctly. And also many thanks to Liz and Guy for agreeing to serve as discussants today. So the paper we're discussing today is part of my now submitted dissertation and is now becoming my book project. The project is on extension of state power in the drylands of Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda. The dryland region, which straddles the borders of the three countries, was neglected by their governments for a century after the region was nominally incorporated into the territories of the three states. But in the last 10-15 years, the drylands have experienced this really radical and rapid extension of the presence and power of the three states. And that is included in some areas construction of state structures, administrative and coercive apparatuses of the state, completely from scratch. And the developments in the drylands are interesting because they allow us to directly observe how states construct such structures of the state, then in a way to observe how states are made themselves. And in particular, they allow us to observe such state-making processes in peripheral areas. And this kind of bringing of peripheries under state control is an important aspect of state making. Historically, has been an important, integral component of state making efforts. And the kind of impetus behind this particular paper was James C. Scott's argument about the attractiveness of statelessness for populations not governed by states. And this argument kind of begs the question: do peripheral populations actually want to be meaningfully incorporated into states? And a corollary of that is the question of what factors affect such preferences, to what extent those preferences can be changed by the actions that states or other organizations take. So these are questions that I explore in this paper, which is based on data that I collected in the drylands in all three countries in 68 research sites in the course of some 12 months of field research in 2016. And the paper is admittedly in a pretty rough shape right now. It's the first draft. So I really look forward to the feedback and suggestions on how that paper can be improved as I take it from here. So thank you. That's it from me.
All right, Liz, over to you. We can't hear you.
Okay, did it work?
There we go.
Okay, I pushed the button, it didn't go. All right. So I don't think I'm going to take all my time either. So I think first I think I've not encountered a paper like this or on this, and so I think that this has I think it has the potential to make quite a big splash, and particularly the last that was really written on state making in African countries was some time ago. And I assigned Herbst, and I think this is an interesting counterpoint to Herbst, the idea that people might not actually want to be incorporated. I think it speaks to the chiefs literature, and various sorts of things. I think the main thing that needs to happen right now is that you need to pick a question. So there's just there's so much going on in this paper, and you're simultaneously trying to get just to measure people's attitudes, but also the conditions under which those attitudes change and how those compare to elites. And with all of that data just being thrown at us, it's very hard to draw out sort of any single takeaway or contribution. And so I think, it's very, very hard to figure out how to slice and dice a dissertation or a book into different pieces. But I think, you're going to have to, I think, because I was just struggling at some point to figure out, what was the one way I would sell this paper to my students, and say, well, how does this contradict whatever or support whatever it is that we're talking about? So I think I'm not really sure where I would suggest that you go. I think I thought all the pieces were interesting, so I think you could get away with any of them. Potentially, the difference between what citizens care about and what leaders care about might be where you want to hang that. But then I would like to see. I think you'd get a lot farther with sort of a single theory of decision making with multiple testable implications, or maybe even just one. Because right now you have a huge number of hypotheses, but they're not really related to each other. They're just sort of empirical regularities that you're expecting. And it wasn't as satisfying as when I feel like I really know why people are doing what they're doing, and I know you're right because there's this thing, this thing, this thing, and this thing that we can all observe in the data. And I think you have the data to do that. Just piecing it all together into that single narrative, I think, would really make it, sort of like a much more wow kind of piece. And when you sort of focus it out, I think then that leaves a lot of room for. I like conjoint analyses. This is that's Liz Carlson does conjoint analyses. But there wasn't the table was all the way in the appendix. I didn't even know it was very hard for me to visualize what you were doing without a clear description of what the conjoints were in the body of the paper. And so I think focusing it, and putting that sort of information in a table where someone can flip through and immediately say, okay, I understand what the manipulations are, and I can see how they map onto the questions, would make it again an easier sell where everybody's sort of on the same page as you are. And there were some things, just to be. Those are all sort of vague things, but because some things were missing from the conjoints, there were places where I was confused. So just in terms of some specific things that I wanted more clarity on, it's a conjoint analysis. You're calling it an experiment, which is fine. There are things that are randomized according to the appendix. But then at one point, I think it was page 15, you said that all subjects were given identical vignettes. and I was very confused as to whether, like, how the randomization was happening, and or whether it was just like an identical protocol. I was confused as to whether people were all seeing the same thing. And there were three rounds, and so was everyone getting the same 3 rounds in the same order? Was everything randomized? And I just didn't. I couldn't tell as a reader. I mean, I'm sure you know the answer to that question, but it made it hard then to know whether I should be concerned about, say, ordering effects, or whether it was really, because if really nothing is changed, then it's not actually conjoint. And so just places in there for those kinds of details to be a little bit more, so you have more room to spell out those kinds of details so everyone feels like they understand what the protocol was. The other thing I would, I did want to see something about ordering effects or consistency bias, because potentially the first time you ask someone something, they answer and then they sort of feel like they have to give the same answer the second and third time. So you do want to potentially either look at just the first round or analyze those ordering effects, or I'm sorry, I don't remember whether you clustered within respondents or put in sort of ordering effects in the analysis. Or potentially that, the second choice was influenced by the first choice. Those kinds of things that would potentially need to be accounted for statistically if you're going to be doing more systematic analyses. The other thing I would just say is that there's a couple places where you say that the literature doesn't talk about something, but it's not actually true. So there are, so I thought that your literature review's fine. I didn't, there wasn't stuff where I was thinking, wow, there's huge amounts missing. But I think you want to be very careful not to say things like no one has looked at this, because there's going to be a reviewer. Invariably, whenever you say that, you're going to get a reviewer who has studied exactly that and is now pissed at you. So just
one.
Yeah, there's no reason to say no one has ever looked at this, right? You can just say like this contrasts or this builds on or whatever else without. You don't need a claim to novelty really to make a contribution. So, okay, that's it.
All right,
Okay.
Thanks so much, Liz. Guy, you have the floor for the next 10 minutes or so, so take it away.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so first I'll start by congratulating you on your dissertation and what seems to be a really great study in the making. Addressing a very important question about state making and regional periphery into modern states, and really it seems that you have engaged in a very impressive and ambitious data collection effort, both quantitative and qualitative. So I want to congratulate you on your achievement. My first comment, and this builds off also with straight from Aldo Bliss's first comment, is that there's at least the version that we read, there's too much going on, and because there's so much going on, it's very difficult to know what exactly is the thing that you are mostly interested in addressing in this paper. And maybe this doesn't need to be a paper, maybe this is a book project, and so be it. But just let's think about the dimension that you have, that you're trying to address in this paper. There's 3 different countries, and you're trying to, and within these countries there's also different tribes, and you want to kind of talk about the differences between them. There's differences between citizens and ordinary citizens and leaders. Then there's differences between different types of leaders, traditional leaders and what you call new leaders. And then there's different domains of incorporation and resistance. Okay, so you're not looking at only one question. You look at like different domains of incorporation and resistance. That's a lot. Okay, and so if you think about and so for each one of them, you want to say in this country, these leaders in that domain, this is what we find. And just it's impossible to, it's really impossible to follow. And so so my first big recommendation is to decide what of all these comparisons is the one that you care most about, and focus on that. Or if this is a book project, you might have a book where a chapter where this is about citizens' preferences. There might be one about like type of leadership. There might be about resistance. There might be a chapter about the different strategies of states in incorporation, and how citizens respond to that. So this is about the different policy domains, and so that would be fine, but it can't be in one paper. Okay, and so I want to make sure that is clear. The second thing, which is related, is given the fact that there's all these possible domains, I want you to focus. There's one thing that I felt that you only touched very briefly, but I would have liked, it could have been the question, or if, I don't know, again, I don't know if this is going to be still a paper or a book project, but something that I want you to encourage to think about, which is the question of sharpening the trade-off between incorporation and autonomy, okay? It is a bit in your, especially when you go into the appendix and you start reading what is the conjoint, the categories and attributes that you put, which I agree with Liz, have to go into the paper. It seems like all good things, and also when you look at the hypothesis, it's all like kind of good things, more security, more service delivery, more, these are the kind of, better welfare outcomes both at the community and the individual level. And so what's the trade-off? Like, obviously people want more from good things. And so, but then there's no puzzle of incorporation. And so I think that one way to think about like moving forward is to think about like, can we talk about what is exactly the trade-off, what is exactly at stake? Okay, what are people losing from incorporation, and trying to identify maybe the type of people that will be willing also to give up all these benefits because autonomy is so important. For example, maybe because some symbolic reasons. So before our talk, I sent you a paper of mine. Not that I'm saying that's the only angle. So the idea is this is a paper that like focuses on like symbolic attachment to land and sacred places, and so the idea is that sometimes people are willing to give up material benefits and security because there's something that is so sacred about the place that they value that symbolism matters a lot to them. I think that is something that you're trying to hint as a possible resistance and a possible rejection of incorporation, but you're not making that like front and center, okay? And so one recommendation is to think about maybe making that front and center, trying to identify those that will, because to find those that say I'm willing to incorporate because if I'm getting more money, more services or better security, that's trivial, okay? And that's just like, yeah, fine. It's the question of like other people that, and if I don't get that, I don't want that, and so that is also trivial. So I think it becomes more interesting where people value autonomy so much that they're willing also to pay some material cost for that, and trying to identify, the type of people, the type of places, and what is like moving that, you sometimes hint that might be something about the history of of relationship, but putting that question front and center, I think, will be something that can push things forward in a beneficial way. A few kind of quicker comments. The first one, and again, this is because I don't think a paper is probably the right venue for that. I felt that I'm missing a lot in terms of the historical perspective. Given the fact that there's like 3 different countries, and so it wasn't sure to me exactly what is the history of the relationship, what facilitated this sudden interest in the dry land, what there's variation between the countries in terms of incorporation policies, what do we know about why there's variation, and maybe the most important question about all that is I was missing a question of whether incorporation is still a politically salient issue or is just moot already. Okay, like, yeah, it's like maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was a politically salient issue, like whether like Uganda state will like, make inroads into Karamoja, but now it's like the question is like, the reason also this is important also from a research design perspective and from us appreciating what is going on is because it is not clear at all that what you're measuring is preferences as compared to satisfaction with what happened in the last 10 years, okay? When we think about preferences, usually we think of something that is ex ante, okay? Like something that we should have measured ideally 15 years ago. But now, given the fact that there's been already 10, 15 years of incorporation and services are better, like, so somebody says, I prefer autonomy, it's not clear to me that this is, is this an ex ante preference or this is just like, you're just measuring satisfaction. I want to echo Lisa's point about like the theoretical, the theory part, which a lot of the hypotheses were not really hypotheses. They were really just, behavioral regularities and assumptions about human decision making, people, and so I'm not sure that you need them, and they're not like really fully tested. How much time do you have, Andy? I can't hear you.
About 2 or 3 more minutes.
Okay, good. So I'm going to use them. Okay, a few comments on the conjoint, and obviously Liz is a much bigger expert than myself. I'll echo some of her and add a few others. The first thing is I think you need a much better justification of why even use a conjoint. Okay, you cannot say, we want to measure preferences and we're going to use conjoint, and I don't think that that's enough. Usually people use conjoint when you have a choice. And we know that people have some preference toward one choice or another, but we don't exactly know why, because the things that motivate the choice are correlated. So, the classic conjoint experiments on candidates where, we don't always know whether it's because of race or because of gender or because of class or because all these things tend to be correlated. And so the kind of the conjoint that randomizes these attributes forces you to kind of allows us to separate these things that in the natural world would be correlated. And so, but you never justify what is this choice that exactly we are looking at? What are these attributes in the world that are most important for this choice? Why do we think that they might be correlated in the world? All these things that like go into a classic conjoint are missing in your paper, and I think that it's very important to do that, especially justifying the attributes and so people put a lot of thought into conjoint. Think about like the classic conjoint of Dan Hopkins and Jens, for example, when they look at you are immigration officer and who you will like bring into the United States, and so all these attributes of like looking at country of origin and speaking English and whether you're high or low skilled, these are all attributes that we think that feed into the decision. Okay. And each one of them is justified, and you don't do this exercise, okay? You're not telling us like why you chose the attributes that you chose. Why did you choose within these attributes the categories that you choose? And so I think this has to is something that you need to do in future iterations. I wanted to, 2 small things. There's a call for some conceptual clarity. For example, I want you to define better what do you mean exactly by incorporation. I want you to explain exactly what do you mean by resistance, what forms can it take, okay? And so that is something that again can help the flow of the paper. And just in terms of other small comment, it would have been nice if you gave some descriptive statistics to show that these regions are really different from other regions of the country. For example, you make all these claims that they tend to be poorer, they tend to have lower service provision, I think just like actually showing that, whether you're using DHS or if you're using census, that we get a sense of how, peripheral these are, how backwards they are. You ask us to believe you that, that these places have been I've been left behind, so to speak. But you don't show us any evidence of that, and so using some descriptive statistics, but also not that it's based on the survey, but based on things like census data and DHS and household national service delivery household surveys that can give us some a better sense than subjective responses to how things were in the past and how things are now. And I have other things, but I think it's good time to open it to the floor.
Great. So Karol, at this point, thank you, Guy. Those were really, really excellent comments. Karol, at this point, you're going to take the floor, and if you want to respond to Liz or to Guy, and maybe elicit more feedback, elaboration, et cetera, et cetera. When you cede the floor, either Guy or Liz can follow up, or I have a few thoughts as well. So the mic is yours.
Great, thank you, and thank you so much for all this extremely helpful feedback. And I agree with most of the criticisms that you have articulated. I do fully agree that there is just way too much going on in the paper for a paper, and yeah, I do face a decision of what to prioritize in writing the paper. So I don't see this little bit of my book project as a separate book project. I decided to spin this part of the project out because there's already so much in the dissertation / the book. So I want this to be a paper, or potentially multiple papers, how to actually organize all the data that I have into a paper, or possibly more than one paper. Well, that's the difficult decision I'm going to have to make. And thank you for the suggestions that you've made. I also agree that there are too many hypotheses, and the hypotheses are definitely not as well presented as they should be. But also to respond to some of the more particular points that you make. So I'll go through the points in the order which I wrote them down. So first thing,
we don't have to have like a back and forth. You don't have to respond to all, because the hour will end. Only things that you probably need clarification, because the hour will end very fast. And so I think just for your use of the time, it's fine to respond if you want. I'm not telling you how to use the time, but I'm just saying I can speak to myself. I can't speak to Liz. We're not expecting you necessarily to respond. I don't need. I think that the time will be better spent if there's big clarification, other points that can be raised, rather than like responding to every single point that we raise.
Yeah, absolutely, and yeah, that's what I was getting to right about now. For the question that Liz had about ordering effects and consistency bias, that's something that I am concerned about, but I'm not entirely sure how to deal with, because I do see a kind of respondents choosing the same options consistently, but I'm wondering if that of consistency bias, or whether it is a display strong preference for one of those options, and the way I see it, either could be so. And if it's the latter, if it's actually that they have very strong preferences for one of the options, well, then that is not at all problematic. It's something that in a way can help me make my argument about it. It's very strong, for example, for state incorporation over independence. But on the other hand, if that is a sign of a bias, well, that is an obvious concern, and I'm not sure how to. So I would definitely appreciate some feedback on that.
So two things. One is just as a robustness check, you can just run it with the first choice that people make, and you can say that so you're not, if it is consistency biased, you're not artificially inflating what you're doing, and then you can just say you don't necessarily need to distinguish. You can just say, well, this shows up as their immediate first pass. And that's if you look at my paper in POQ, I do that in terms of I actually take the rounds out because I'm worried about social desirability bias, and essentially people figure out what you're asking over time. But so you can just do that as a robustness check. But the other thing, if you're worried about, I mean, this consistent but potentially unmeasured preferences and taste are a huge issue in conjoint. And that's why, for example, I use, if you look up train, the Kenneth Train, that's where conditional logit comes in, or mixed logit, where essentially you're putting in effects that allow you to withdraw individual level variations and very strong preferences to back out really the overall effects of these things on the population as a whole. And I don't think you use mixed logit, right?
No, I just use.
Yeah, and the Heinmuller et al. Is very straight. I mean, they're just essentially taking differences of means, calling them fancy things. And that's actually fine because a conjoint analysis is just a fully factorialized experiment, essentially. But if you're worried about these tastes, or if you want to show that it's robust to just sort of stochastic strong preferences that aren't real, then you would want to parcel those out with a mixed logit analysis. You'll probably get exactly the same thing.
I don't have much to add to that, but I will say conceptually that some people will take issue with the way you talk about preferences in general. You know, most people think, or many people think, that preferences are stable, but not malleable. And there's a difference between preferences and choice. So my preference could be that I always will take something that will give me a higher payoff. Okay, if your conjoint is, if my higher payoff is incorporation, I take incorporation. If the higher payoff is autonomy, I'll take autonomy. That doesn't mean that you change my preference. My preference has been stable. You just change the information that I have about which option is better. And so you need to be careful when you discuss malleability of preferences, where you seem to, we didn't even put us a trade-off. You basically say people prefer, higher income, better security, and and so I don't know. I would be just careful in describing the fact that different people might be taking different choices as the fact that you're like somehow manipulate the preference.
So I'm like, on the one hand, I agree. I'm like, there is definitely need to disentangle preferences and actions that people take in response to some pressure that or influence that they face. But on the other hand, I'm not sure I agree with the other point you make, because there is this huge literature on preference formation. So we do know that people's preferences do change over time. So my approach in this paper was to take this as given and try to figure out which specific factors actually ability of preferences. So there is it's a trade-off here. So on the focus of the paper, should I try to focus more on disentangling preferences from whatever else you would call the effects on the actions that people take, or they just follow where I think the literature leads me and just call that preferences, but I don't have a ready a fully developed response to that now.
I don't know. I don't think that that's really important. I think that you get lost in these discussions. I think the most important is what's the research question, and what's the trade-off that you're trying to, highlight. And so I thought that, and this is just one direction that could this literature. I mean, this topic better than I. So there might be other more interesting questions. I thought that an interesting question is to say something like people have a strong taste for autonomy. Okay, and trying to understand how strong this, preference to autonomy is, and what are people, when do we, are we seeing that people are willing to trade off material benefits in order to maintain autonomy or not? Okay, or not? And if so, when. And so trying to understand that aspect of, and trying to really, dig into that, because that way it's become interesting. Because it's really less interesting to say that you find that, like, people more support option A or option B when it's like this option is, better security and better services. I mean, I think it seems pretty obvious, and so, but other people that are willing to forego that, okay, and so try, and maybe it's symmetric. Maybe people are willing to forego in both places. Maybe people have really strong, they really want incorporation, and even if because like they don't want to be like controlled by their local leaders, or maybe they really want to be autonomous because the state presents a threat to their way of life, and they care so much about it they're willing to forego, and trying to identify that aspect. Who are these people? How big this group is? Okay, I think that could be like a very interesting, trying to basically highlight the trade-offs. Okay, that's what politics is about.
No, sorry, do you want to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, I think potentially the way you might want to think of this that would, I think, resolve both what Guy is looking for and sort of what I would want to see is, you don't have to do a formal model, but people, I mean, I think we're looking for people's utility functions, right? We want to know, and there's the psychological aspects that Guy is pointing out that are interesting. I just care about autonomy. I want to feel like I have control over my life. But there's also material trade-offs. Obviously, public services, you don't get them for free. There's taxation. There's you have to abide by rules and regulations that you might not prefer. There's also the choice between, rebellion itself is costly, right? And so even if you're not happy with incorporation, you might still get more utility out of that than you would out of rebelling, right? So there's all these things that people are thinking about, and you could call that their preferences, right? Potentially, but really what you mean is there's a utility function, and we can back out what we think people's utility functions must be by the choices they make. And what you're observing is the choices they make, but of course you've systematically changed what's going into the choices. So you're moving the parameters of a utility function, and that would tell you, so maybe you can't necessarily test. I don't know if you didn't necessarily manipulate directly how strongly people feel attached to autonomy or to land, but you potentially having a local leader is far more autonomy than having a leader imposed from the outside, right? So you can back something out about that. Or and this would be different if you're talking about leaders, right? Presumably leaders have a different utility function. So I think you should pick either leaders or citizens to focus on. But at some point we just need to see some model, whether it's formalized or not, but some model of the wheels that are turning in people's heads. So that, or the levers that are being pulled, right? And so you could say the implication is, well, if you pull this lever, you're going to get people happier than if you pull this other lever, or there's no way you could ever change this thing, or
Yeah, I mean, you put it so much better than I did. I will say that one leverage, and this is again building on the paper that I shared with you, and I'm happy to share it with Liz and Andy as well, because it's also a conjoint. But basically, what we did in that paper is we said, in order to get some leverage on exactly the question that you mentioned, Liz, is to look at like who makes a choice, for example, in this case would be, for example, autonomy when everything is bad, okay? Or, and so even if you like security becomes worse, even if, your economic condition worsens, even when like your leaders get rejected, do you still support autonomy in this case, okay? And for this, the taste to autonomy is like the strongest because they're foregoing all the good things. And so looking at like what share of the population and trying to define who those people are is like it's a useful exercise. But again, I'm not saying that that's the only interesting angle, okay? But it's a potential angle that you can take to make this slightly more to try and bring kind of a politics into the question, because I think the thing that I'm missing is there's no politics if everything is good. Okay, I mean there's no politics if you support incorporation because you're getting better services and low low security. It just becomes a question like, are people happy when they're better? Yes, they're happy when they're better. That doesn't make for like a compelling exposition.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just building on. Sorry, Karol, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to add, the similar idea of sort of nailing down what the trade-off is. When I was reading this, one of the things that struck me was, it seems to me like there isn't a lot to lose by the government reaching out, because it's really going to be up to these pastoralists to kind of engage with the government. I mean, by their very nature, these groups tend to be quite mobile, right? And the Kenyan state, at least, which is the one I know, even in these areas, tends to be quite sedentary. So, I was looking at this and kind of wondering, isn't this a lot like, Martin Channick's work on law in colonial societies, where the Brits or the French come in and they set up all these systems, and basically, you have the local population sort of forum shopping to get the outcome they want. Do they go to this traditional leader? Do they go to the colonial court? And I just I was wondering if this wasn't somewhat of an analogous situation. Where you can have these guys here, but especially in this area of the country, if people want to be remote from the state, they can travel, right? Have cows will travel. Which brings me to my second point, which is, at some point you're going to have to address this idea of how does the sample that you've chosen, the area that you've chosen, really limit what you can say about state building in Africa, in the sense that, these are just explicitly mobile groups, right? These are not like, the Kikuyu or other people who are, generally work certain areas of land doing agriculture. And, especially when politics, is supposed to be about, and state building is supposed to be about geographic representation and the spread of the state across land. It seems like, pastoralists are like perennially the groups that, just can't be pinned down. So, I was left wondering, how does this limit this sort of broader applicability of what you're trying to say? Finally, 2 points sort of related to this. One is, I'm assuming you'll push this in an article direction. If so, at a certain point, you're going to have to figure out how much of the anthropology of this you want to kind of incorporate. And right now, I felt like I was getting lost in the regional anthropology of these different groups. And, my sense, and, my colleagues may shout me down on this, is that that's just not going to play over too well in a political science journal, unless there's something, about the differences between the Afan Borana and the Ngala Pokat, like have something to do with differential effects of say your conjoint, and it's not clear to me right now that they are. Finally, state incorporation is really about the spread of the state, and it seems like there's a whole literature on the spread of markets, which is sort of quite analogous to this, that I didn't really see you dig into. It seems to me like, especially with respect to Kenya, Jean Ensminger's Making a Market is, a good place to start on that literature, and I'm sure there could be some good political science-y kinds of insights you could draw from her book on this, spread of the market in Ormaland on the other side of Kenya. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to you, Karol.
Great, thank you. Some great suggestions. Thank you for suggesting the literature on the spread of markets, because I can see that being directly relevant. So, and in a way, we do see that in the dryland region. So, extension of state power is kind of like involved spread of national economies and creation and extension of those economies into parts of Kenya, Ethiopia, and Uganda that were until that point cut off from access to markets and trade and business. And we see the opening of new business opportunities and growth of towns in the region. And we see this massive economic effect. It's kind of like there's a bit of a lag. So first we see state extension and then market extension, but we see this massive development in large part because the process of extension of state power has been so radical. So for a century, a major reason why local populations were not meaningfully incorporated into states were exactly what you were saying. Those populations are nomadic or semi-nomadic, can easily move from one place to another, and so are difficult to control. But the really remarkable thing is that it has increasingly come to an end, or is coming to an end. Right. It's partly because of the gradual erosion of pastoral livelihoods, but more so because countries have developed the capacity to project their power over that remote territory and control and engage with population, even though that population is still to a large extent semi-nomadic. Which is why I think, like, in a way, this represents a kind of like a difficult test for any theory of state making, because what we see here is state making happening in an area where state making is unusually difficult, and I think that does offer some valuable insights. To go back to what Liz was saying earlier about utility functions, I'm like, that's a great way of looking at this through the lens of utility functions more so than preferences. So that's a really great suggestion. And the way I think about my data and what's going on there is exactly what you were saying, which is why I wasn't entirely clear why Guy was telling about all those unclear trade-offs there, because to me, and perhaps I do not do a good enough job of presenting that or explaining that in the paper, but to me the trade-offs between kind of attractiveness of statelessness on the one hand and attractiveness of state incorporation are fairly clear, because there are material benefits, those public goods to which people can gain access through the state, but at the same time the state involves taxation and in some cases oppression and so on. Whereas autonomy is not only of symbolic value, although that is important, but there are also some material incentives to keeping the state at arm's length and not be subject to that taxation and oppression, and regulate security and things like that through local institutions, which after all have existed for, well, in some cases, centuries.
I would say, so that's not in the paper, but and maybe it's in other parts of your dissertation, maybe it's in your head, but it's not in the paper that we read. And so, you might want to make that like clear. It would be also interesting to see if your survey included questions about that, to see the descriptives of the answers to some of these things, even if it's not as part of the conjoint, for example. Do people think that they will get a better service? Do you think people will have, what do they think about taxation? Do you think that they will be subjected to tax? It's not as if taxation is. There's so much taxation going on in Africa anyway, and so it's not clear to me that people necessarily would think that there will be, there's going to be, taxation on a nomadic population. I mean, what will form of taxation that will look like? And so, so even just looking at what they think in terms of like just they're saying there is a trade-off. The loss of autonomy comes, in the sense of like, here's the things that they're worried about, and show us that they're actually worried about that. If you have the data from the survey, that would be very valuable, because it might, it's kind of a, it's a bit like maybe separating reality from myths. People say that a lot, but maybe that's not the case. I don't know, maybe it is the case. I don't know.
So I think that if, I think it's important to say what kind of trade-off you're focusing on, because it is obvious that there are trade-offs. But the psychological trade-offs that Guy is interested in is a totally different literature. Because there's a huge literature now, of course, on like voluntary, essentially the conditions under which people allow themselves to be taxed in a low-capacity state. Jessica Gottlieb is doing a lot. There's a Medicaid on it, isn't there now? A new Medicaid on taxation, right? Mm-hmm. So that's an entirely different literature. There's of course also a conflict literature on when people choose to rebel versus not, and I'm actually involved in a project on that right now, and it turns out that trying to model all the psychological material stuff, it's actually really complicated, and there's certain pieces of your, so one way to focus it is the paper is to decide which people you're interested in, but another way is to figure out which cost trade-off you're interested in, because you do have a security question in there about whether rebellion would succeed, or you've altered the cost of rebellion. But presumably, I mean, there's all these other things working in the periphery, but until you actually spell out which ones you're looking at, it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard for the reader not only to pick up, to be convinced that you've matched your conjoint to your theory, but also, I mean, these really are the contribution and the way that your work would add is going to be totally different depending on which literature you're talking to.
And again, Liz is much better, and more eloquent. What I was trying to.
Sorry.
Yes. No, I'm just saying that's exactly +1. That's exactly like, it's not that there are no trailers, there are several, and you need to be very clear about which are the ones that you care about, and like matching them to a literature that is relevant to that trade-off, because that is at least a good hook to organize, papers and thoughts. So.
And then you get 3 papers, right?
At least.
Or, yeah, right. Yeah, there's a lot going on.
So, Karol, we're running down to our last minutes here. If there's any way you'd like to redirect, any final points you'd like to check in, or Liz, Guy, if you've got any additional ammunition, now's the time to use it.
No, I will say.
Do you have any more?
No, I will say that one thing that is underused here is the fact that you have to be different countries, and I felt like you're kind of glossing over. There's like one story that you're telling about his 3 countries that didn't incorporate at all, like this like region, and suddenly 10 years ago, all of them like decide to do that, and just at some point like there's like really no variation, and the only places where you learn that there's some variation is through your interpretation of results of some of the conjoined. You say, we find like only here, and that makes a lot of sense because like Ethiopia did this, and like this makes a lot of sense because Uganda made this, and I'm like, okay, and so I think that like one avenue that I would have liked you to think more carefully in future draft, whatever the direction that you take, is to I think you need to make a decision of how much this fact that you have 3 different countries is important in your story, and you know better about like, is there something that you can like take advantage in terms of like different strategies that the states have used, different policies of incorporations that you want to highlight, different histories that might affect the trajectories that took place, that you want to take advantage of, rather than telling a relatively homogeneous story that like all 3 countries are exactly the same. Maybe this is the case, but I'm not sure that this is the case.
No, the 3 countries are definitely not the same, and they are united by the fact that the same kind of process of extension of state power started more or less the same time and has folded in fairly similar ways. But at the same time, we do see a very high degree of variation both across countries and across the regions. I fully agree with your point about presentation. I should introduce material earlier because I understand why maybe like a bit unexpected to find so much variation when I start talking about the conjoint results, not having introduced that early in the paper. And that is another trade-off for me to decide on how much of that variation I want to integrate and present in the paper, while at the same time trying to tell a story or develop an argument that is, people can engage with relatively easily in a paper format.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of like, it's not clear what all these conjoints are exactly doing for you just because it's not clear what is the conjoint needs to be like the thing that supports some argument that you wanna make. And so, I can see a paper that is about, here's the 3 countries in East Africa, they're all engaging at the same time in this like expansion of the state, but say there's some big variation in like how successful they were, and you want to make an argument that this is about like, this is because of, I don't know, whatever, the way they incorporated the elites into the, and then And so you have an argument about that, and then the conjoint is just kind of the thing that shows, okay, that or your survey that like gives us the empirical evidence to like a relatively well-defined problem. And so I think like really we're starting to like wind down the time, but like there's many choices that you can make. You can take it in different directions. There's probably more than one paper here. A lot of these questions are very interesting, but at the end of the day, like the empirical apparatus that you put has to be in support of a very well-defined and narrowly defined research question rather than what we have now. And we know it's an early draft, so we might be a bit too harsh.
Great. Any final words, Karol, Liz, Guy?
I just want to congratulate you again on like really such interesting project, and really question of like state incorporation of peripheries, like foundational to African politics. We didn't have a big book on that since like probably Herbst and and Kathy Boone, and so there is a real potential that this will be such a big contribution, and so really I want to like congratulate you on addressing such a huge, big, important, thorny question, and wish you luck going forward.
No, thank you. I really appreciate it, and I do think that I do have some interesting findings. The challenge for me now is to find a way to present those findings, the results that I have, in a way that will be suitable for a political science audience and will attract interest. So thank you so much for your feedback today. It will definitely help me enormously as I move forward with the project.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andy, for organizing that. Really, it's amazing.
Well, thank you, Guy Grossman, Liz Carlson, Karol, Czuba, whose name I again slaughtered. Thank you all for joining us, and I'm sure I'll see you all again at a conference or at another online colloquium.